Hello and welcome to this training session. My name is Ashraf Ayad and I'll be working with you today on the workflow between Maya, Mudbox and rendering with Mentor Ray at the end. So here if you examine our scene, we're looking at a model of a fish that you'll see that we have different sculpt layer. And I have multiple paint layers, for example color speck and bump as well for the diffuse speck and bump as well. If we point out here something that's really cool about Mudbox, I'm just going to enable this layer, which is the ambient occlusion layer that I baked already. If I go to the material editor, we'll see that for Mudbox it can read reflections via EXR file. So if you have an EXR file that you want to use as a reflection map, it can obviously use that. And also the thing that I want to point out, any EXR compression, it will be read as well, because it seems that one of the misconceptions that some customers have. So for example, if I locate some of my EXR files, for example, I have one with PIZ reflection. Let me increase the reflection just a tad so you can see it, and also a zip, and of course the PRX. So all of them will work here nicely without having to worry about that. So that's also one thing that you should remember as well. Because you can easily achieve a different look that is very realistic and is very cool to have right here inside the Mudbox. So I'm gonna close that again. Oh, I might as well also point out how the scales were done. It's just a neat feature. Is new here. Create a sphere and create a new sculpt layer. And I want to enable the mask feature, just because I want to see it when I paint it. And then I will go to my mask tool here, and I'm going to use a stencil. And actually, if you notice here when I start to paint, because this is a low poly model, it doesn't have enough subdivisions. That's why it didn't come out correctly. So let me subdivide this a couple of times so we have enough geometry. Let's disable the mirroring, and just pretty much what I'm painting is an areas that will be only affected by my sculpt tool. I can disable that. And now if I want to paint regularly, sculpt regularly, you'll notice here if I start doing that, I'm elevating the areas that are not selected up towards me. Or actually, what is happening is that these are going up towards the normals. If you look at the advanced section of the tool, it's going towards the direction of the average normals. But what we want to do actually is to go towards the direction of the camera, and then we're going to move the camera a little bit towards the side like that. So whenever I brush like that, for example, okay, disable that, and look in here, you will see it's got elevated towards an angle where the brush was. So simply you just do a smooth brush on it, smooth operation, and you can actually reduce the effect a little bit, and you'll have something like that, which is happening very quickly. So I'm just gonna open my fish. One other thing I want to point out is the way that I painted the fish really fast actually, and I used an image that I grabbed from the net. It's an Oscar fish, and all I've done is to use that as a stencil. Go back to my image and make sure that I'm on the paint for the diffuse. Go my paint tool, projection, move my image around. So for example, if I find something that I really like here, and just brush, and that will transfer directly down to the fish itself or the model. And the greatest thing about Mudbox is that it doesn't rely on the actual geometry to paint. The painting is done through the image that you decide. So for example, if I decide an image here, this is the size I decide. I could be 512, 1024, whatever image you decide is not really conditioned with the poly count. Another important thing that you should point out here is that whenever you get a chance to use a bump rather than displacement or a sculpt, this is what you should do. For example, if I want to add a little bit of information in here, so I'm just going to go back to my sculpt layer. Let's say I want to add some bumps in this area. You see, it's not really smooth enough for me, so that means I have to divide this one more time, the object one more time, but for no reason for that, because I can easily do that as a paint layer in the bump value, and go to paint, and of course we need to be black. So you see now I can get away with this very easily, and it's still very high quality because the image itself is high quality. So I can do that without having to divide the object. That will save you time also in the render, so you don't have to divide everything. If you can get away with it in a bump, then that's what you should be doing. Let's do that and go back to my original file. Alright, let me disable this and diffuse as well. And now we have a raw, and I'm going to go down to the lowest level. Alright, I want to point out here something. This object, the lowest level was 0, because this is the object that we took out from Maya and we did our work in here. If I'm going to take this object, I want to point out here, if I go to level 1, see this area here has changed. So that what you're doing is when you take this object to Maya, you're expecting the displacement to go towards that area and give you that formation. And that is not going to happen. You want to make sure that you take a level that's going to be correct to your object. What I'm trying to say is level 0 is not usually the one that you want. I want to take, for this particular example, I want to take level 2 because I have more definitions of the gills in here. And let me show you what I mean by that when I export the object. So I'm going to select the object level 0, file, export selection, and I'll take it as take level 0, this one, go to level 1, I'm going to take that as well, level 1, and this is the level that I'm going to be working with. And it still is not very high because you can see the poly count here is 7,000. So I'm just going to select that and export selection, and that's the one that I'm going to be using. Let's call it to Maya. And look at it when we go to Maya here, what's the difference and how that's going to affect us between these levels. If I go to level 0, I want to point out something that I'm doing here for this particular example, which is I'm having the fish UVs on multiple tiles. So you'll notice in here, this is the tile 0 to 1. And this is what most people will put their UVs in here. However, you can extend and place your object UVs on different tiles. And the advantage of doing that is I can have multiple displacement, multiple normal maps, or multiple diffuse maps per area of UVs. What that allows me to do is I have a better quality of displacement, because the image, rather than having all the displacement information cramped in then one 1024, for example, by 1024, I can have two 1024s, and this way I have higher quality. So one idea would be rather, okay, why don't you just extract the displacement to 4K or 8K, whatever the size is. When you go to Maya and you want to render this, you want to make sure that to have a memory efficient files, and by having multiple files, it allows Maya or MentorRay, when it renders, is to use one tile, then dump it, and then use the other when it comes to this part of the calculation. So having multiple UVs will help you in your render time at the end. Of course, there is nothing wrong with having one. It all depends on what your image is and how close the camera is going to be from that fish. I want to go back to the last level, which is the highest. And I want to point out the value of the number. Actually, sorry, the number. For example, if you're trying to calculate it and you couldn't catch it because of the heads-up display gone down, you can look down here at the bottom, and this is the 497 and some change. But this is quad number, so I wrote it down here. This is the value that we're going to be trying to achieve, but this is quad, all right? And I want to point out when we go to MentorRay renders is tries, so that means I have to make that conversion. Now I'm ready to extract my files. Just to go to extraction operation, and as you see here, I already highlighted all the images that I want to take out. So I want to take the ambient occlusion, and the target model is here is the my lowest. And for example, I'm taking 1024 for this particular example, and the quality is good. I can go further, but good is fine, my work. And I'm taking this one as PNG. Displacement map, I'm taking this one as from level 2, as I point out, because now you can, in Mudbox 2010, you can choose which level you're going to work from. So I'm taking from level 2 to level 5. And I'm taking it as, again, 1024, and I'm using the best guess closest to target model, and I'm taking this as EXR file, 32-bit. And the normal maps are 8 bits, so you can't choose it an EXR. It won't make any difference. But since I'm going to Maya, I'm choosing the compatibility to Maya, and the same thing for the best guess. And of course, the coordinate space is tangent. I already exported these files, so you don't have to wait for it and do that. All I did is just hit extract. The only thing I want to point out here is the maps. This is TGA. The only file that here was done is TIFF, which is the bump value. And the only reason I did that because I want to point out when I take it to Maya. So if I go to my image browser here for a second, you'll see my extracted maps are done. This is the 32-bit displacement. So you can see by adding the plus on your keyboard, it go up and high down in the values of the displacement. So I'm just going to 0 to reset. This is the ambient occlusion, and this is the normal map. So we're ready pretty much to go and work in our file in Maya. I thought I took a moment here and speak a little bit about the colors and why do we refer to the 32-bit as the color of choice when we are extracting displacement. You want to point out that when we're using the term bit color, for example, 8 bits, we're referring to the bits per channel. If we have, for example, if you go to the back here, 1 bit, so the 2 of the power of 1, 2 bits, 2 of the power of 2. So when we talk about 8 bits, that means 2 to the power of 8, which means 256 colors. So if we're doing RGB, that means 256 by 256 by 256. So if we refer now to the 32-bit colors, here you go, it will produce 2 billion, not million, billion distinct colors. And that's why we have more variation in the displacement, and that's what we needed to be baked in when we extract the displacement map to have more values. Color channels, however, you don't need more than the regular 8-bit. So that's why we took it out as 8-bit, which is PNG or TGA files. Let's move into Maya. I want to explain the theory behind multiple UV tiles and how it can be used within Maya. So for example, if we look at this object, I have it divided to a couple of UV tiles, these two faces here and these two faces here. If I assign a new material, example Lambert, and place one single texture file, you will see it got repeated to the other UVs, because in the texture node itself we have the option to say wrap around the UV or not. So if I disable that, that means this image only assigned to this particular UV tile and it's not wrapping to the other side. However, if you see here at the end, whatever the image is leaving a gray color, and that is controlled by this, which is the default color. So if I change this to, you'll see it affecting here. But since we don't want any effect on that color, now what if I want to put another image in here? So for this, to my hypershade, I'm going to grab another file node. So let's have a quick examination. When we say this one is not wrapping, this one as well should not wrap. For this particular tile, but this one, if I assign, let's say I'm going to hook this to color, and for this guy, if you go to the UV texture editor, you see it repeated to the left, which is the minus of the U. That means I need to translate my frame or the image to a -1 in here. And of course the same thing apply, that if you want this so if I hook this back to the regular color, image now to appear in here, I can use a multiply divide node. I can simply drag the file node to be the default color. Now if we do a quick render, you should see it copied to the other side. You can also view it by going to the shader under the hardware texture and change the texture resolution to something like high, and now it should be displayed, or maybe you go a little bit. But just be aware of that, it takes a toll of your memory because it needs to utilize the graphic card. You can also view it by, let me go back to default, and changing the panel render view to high quality rendering. So also that will appear in here. Alright, so let's create new scene, and when I do an import, I want to make sure that I open the option box and make sure that you change the file type OBJ and it's getting in as a single object, because if I set this to default, when you do the OBJ import, it comes in as multiple objects. I want to make sure it comes in as single object. Okay, import, and I'm going to go grab my file, and let me show you what do I mean by the levels. So if level 0, this is the fisher level 0, level 1. So we know that when we subdivide an object in Maya or Mudbox, it takes whatever quad and quadruple it. So that means if we look at, for example, this part here behind the eye, you will see it got divided 4 times. This poly here and here, it's this one in here. That means it's quadrupled. In theory, if I subdivide this guy once and do mesh smooth, and so in theory this is the same as this. This object is here, It's equivalent to the numbers of here. Matter of fact, if I click in this guy, so the number of faces we have is 1944. This also 1944. And you will see here, let's go to the side view. And this is what I was referring to. If you subdivide the object in Maya, you do not get that location of that point. That point is way up here. So that's why I didn't want to choose that lowest level. Also, dividing an object in Maya does not mean equally the same object that came from Mudbox. And what I mean by that, even though that they have the same exact number of faces, if I go to the animation section, for example, and I create a blend shape between these two objects, go to the animation editor, blend shape here, for example, you see that. And that's because this object in the eyes of Maya does not mean equals that object. And the reason I said that, because in Maya there's something called vertex ID. Every vertex that we have here has a specific value. So Mudbox, when it divides the object, it gives it arbitrary numbers. It's different than how Maya reads these numbers. So that's why I said you want to make sure when you bring a model in Maya, you do not subdivide it anymore. That means when I'm doing my workflow, as you'll see here, I'm bringing the file from Mudbox and I'm using that file. I don't rely on subdividing here and say, oh, it's going to be the same. Right, so file, new, and let's bring the original one, import, and I'm going to use the one that's called to Maya. So I have the most of the definition of the object, I have the most elements are there, and now I can start adding my images. Another important thing I want to point out is if I go to my window setting and preference, and in the rendering section, I'm enabling the use Maya style alpha detection. That's because the way that mental array reads alpha is slightly different than what Maya used to. So if we're using this example, you want to make sure that this will allow you, when you're rendering your displacement, you don't get this bloating effect. So if you ever get that, you know that you should enable that option here in the preference edit. Now to assign the textures, you can add them one by one like I showed you previously, or I created a simple mill script with the help of some of my friends, and by doing that you select the object, you have multiple channels we're going to import. So for example, I started the displacement, extracted map, and I know it's the EXR files, and I'm also going to bring the normal maps, and let me get color. The colors will be saved wherever you save the files. I'm having the diffuse, and I have ambient occlusion as well. Actually, let me get the bump. And the bump is coming as a stiff, but I want to point out why it's going to have a problem, so and how I'm going to fix it. And the last thing is the ambient occlusion. And what you see here with the Mudbox, it extracts the files based on whatever name we have, along with the UV where the UV should be. So that means UV1, V1, that's the first tile. That means UV -1, the one on the negative side or the left side. All you have to do is just select one of them, and this mill script will recognize. Hit create and close. You will see now in the hypershade we have a shader and graph, rearrange graph, that placed all the connections for me. So if I render this, everything should be fine. However, actually let me render this as is, and let me switch to Mentorray, and you'll see why we're going to get a problem. Alright, and here it is, error. Mentorray fish file that is stiff, a file format is not supported. And this error is because that TIFF file that generated out of Mudbox has something called LZW compression, and that compression is not supported by Mentorray. So I need to go, so inside of Photoshop, I'm just going to resave these TIFF files as TGA, just to get rid of that compression. I could have saved it as another TIFF, but and get rid of the compression, but I'm just showing you the idea. And that's why when I did my saving, when I choose the colors, I choose it to TGA, so I don't have to go through this process. All right. Now in Maya, I'm just going to go to my hypershade and the bump. I'm just going to change the extension. So now if I try to render as is, we have the render is done. Obviously there's lots of things to change and fix, but at least we got rid of this error. Use the bump a little bit so it's not overwhelming. Okay, now let's go and adjust our scene. And if you're wondering where can you find that mill script, it's on the area under the obviously downloads and scripts, and it's called the multi-channel setup tool. So let's go back and see how can we adjust our Maya file. I'm just going to go back to my hypershade, and just because I'm working with lots of channels, I want to make sure that I am looking at the proper thing. So let me rearrange graph. Rather than being confused with all these channels, I'm just going to disable a few of them and only work with one by one. So for now, I'm just getting the displacement. In your rendering section, go render current frame. Usually the default is warning. I'm going to make it progress. So this way, when I render, in the output window, you will have the triangle count, which include the tessellation. this value number, or actually this number, is tries. So that means if I'm going to compare it with my original number that I got from Mudbox, and this is quad, so that how many tries in a quad, obviously I have to multiply that by 2. So obviously this number has to match this value. If you go to the object node itself, under the shape node, under displacement, there's an option that says feature displacement. And this option, by default, enables center array under the hood to do some sort of a tessellation. So if I disable the feature displacement, I'm going to go to rendering array approximation node, and I'm going to assign one from me. And by default, once you hit create, it will create one that's called array subdivision approximation 1. It assign the method of approximation or division under the hood is going to be parametric. That means every quad will be divided equally. So if I render this for now, you'll see we have a nicer or a little bit smoother render, but as an output, we still have way to go. In order to calculate this, you have to ask yourself, in Mudbox, how many divisions was higher than this object that I'm working with? So this was level 2, so that means 3, 4, and 5 is above me. That means I need to divide 3 times. Render. Look at the output. And now we have a number that matched the number of quad that was in Mudbox. So this is how I did the calculation. And you notice I did not do the option in Maya that says 3. If you press 3, that will subdivide, because this option actually will confuse Maya for this division, because it has a different type of division. So I left it by pressing 1. And this option that I'm talking about is here, the smooth mesh object. So I did not use that because it has a different algorithm. I'm using the array approximation node to give me my calculation. So I'm getting a little bit closer to what I want. Also, one thing I want to point out, the way that this happened in 2009 and up, there is a type of approximation called CC mesh, which is very, very fast. I can get this here, and let me go a little bit behind the quality. I'm going to go to production. But once I enable production, it enables a very high value of ray trace. And since I'm not having anything that will require all these rays, so I'm just going to make this 2x4 and render this one more time. A little bit better in the quality we have. You see here, these harsh edges are gone because we are using better anti-aliasing calculation. However, with the CC mesh, there's a bug that gives us smooth border between the two UV tiles, might get a seam. So for this, I'm gonna write a little script here, which is add adder and the my proxy CC mesh in the subdivision approximation. So this node is the same node name that I have on that object. So once I do that, I hit apply, you will see I disabled the CC mesh. So the render time might be a little bit longer. So you'll see here the render time has jumped from 5 seconds to 13, so almost doubled. But we'll get rid of any UV edge seam that we might have. So this is if we're going to use just displacement. So I'm just going to go back to my hypershade. Now let's have a quick look at the normals. Alright, so this is the connection for normal maps and bump maps as well. So I'm just going to disable that. I just want the normals. And I'll grab these guys, and I'm just going to drag the bump here. So I'm reconnecting the normal maps. If I look in here, these are tangent, which is mean reading the normal maps. So let's have a quick look. Keep that image. Alright, so almost no change in difference in render time, but a huge difference in the displacement and how it's very prominent now. So that means I don't have to really render the displacement to all this high subdivision. I can even lower that, and that will be a little bit faster render time. So keep that image here for a second, because then I will rely on the display on the normal map to give me that extra edge of displacement. So this is before and this is after. Alright, so it's going to be up to you, and you have to decide, will that render time, change in render time is needed? Do I really need to subdivide that object to be that much? Remember, this is a simple scene. If you have a complicated scene, you might really rely on that. And that's using the normal map might give you that extra edge that you need, so you don't have to subdivide all the time. But for me, I'm just going to lower the subdivision to 2 because I don't need that so many divisions, and I'm going to rely on normal maps. I want to select the camera, and I want to choose a better film.